Today we are visiting the Dunolly Cemetery in Victoria's central goldfields region to explore the final resting place of an English convict, one of two brothers, who were transported to Van Diemen's Land in 1836 for the theft of 11 chickens. His name was Benjamin Bones. The Bones brothers were named Thomas and Benjamin, and Thomas was born in Kent around 1801, and his brother Benjamin was born 11 years later in the village of Buxted, Sussex, England. Well, obviously England, but and by 1835 both men were working as farm labourers in the village of Framfield. Now that year Benjamin was indicted for stealing 11 chickens belonging to a man named Thomas Norman. And according to the evidence, Mr. Norman had noticed the poultry missing in July and upon visiting Benjamin's house found the chickens there alive. Benjamin claimed they were his own, but Mr. Norman was certain they were his. Benjamin was found guilty and sentenced to 7 years transportation. He was 24 years old. Just a month later, his brother Thomas was also charged with stealing chickens from the same man, if you can believe it. He too was found guilty and received a sentence of 7 years transportation. And Thomas was 34 years old. Both brothers had prior convictions, which likely influenced the severity of their sentences. It appears that Benjamin may have first been charged at the age of 9 for receiving stolen goods. He was whipped and sentenced to 1 year of prison. Now in 19th century England, it was common for children to be imprisoned, often under the same harsh conditions as adults. At the time, there was no legal distinction between child and adult offenders, meaning children as young as 7 could be arrested, tried and sentenced to prison or even death for crimes ranging from theft to vagrancy. Many of these children were from impoverished backgrounds and committed petty crimes out of necessity. The Bones brothers were placed aboard the transportation ship Henry Porcher, which departed England on the 1st of August 1836 and arrived in Van Diemen's Land 3 months later on the 15th of November. Thomas's convict record described him as having a bad character. However, his behaviour appears to have improved on the whole, because his Hulk report described him as having a good character. And unfortunately, I haven't been able to locate a record of which Hulk ship the brothers were held on, and it's likely they spent at least 3 months on board a Hulk before being transferred to the Henry Porcher for transportation. Now, this is Benjamin, according to his convict description, and I've noticed lately that ChatGPT, with their upgrade, has started to give the convicts these kind of suits. They're dressed all in the same suit, and I've kind of have to work on that because it's very strange. But anyway, that's what you get using AI. Now it is interesting to note that Benjamin, the younger brother, was married, and he had 1 child at the time of his transportation. His wife's name was Anna, and it records that she was at Buxted, which is the village where Benjamin was born and not too far from Framfield, when Benjamin was accused of stealing the chickens. Now, there is no record indicating that his wife and child travelled with him to Australia or joined him later. It was a harsh punishment, not only for Benjamin but also for his family, who were left behind to face the consequences of his absence and obviously his income, and they likely never saw one another again. Now, both the brothers' conduct records were relatively free of serious offences. In 1837, Thomas was assigned to a Mr. Kelly, and over a period of 2 months, he was charged twice, once for drunkenness and once for using improper language, and he was sentenced to 7 days in the cells on bread and water. After the second offence, he was returned to government service, as Mr. Kelly no longer had use for him. Now, Benjamin received one charge for willful neglect of duty, along with repeated absences from his place of residence at night, possibly for unlawful purposes and disobedience. He was sentenced to hard labour, although unfortunately the rest of his record is very difficult to read, and it appears he was reassigned, but the location is unclear. The brothers were granted tickets of leave in January of 1844, and this allowed them to live and work within a designated district, earn wages and manage some personal affairs, rather than being confined to a penal settlement or a jail. However, they remained under supervision and they were required to report on a regular basis to authorities, follow strict behavioural rules and stay within their assigned area unless granted permission to leave. A ticket of leave could be revoked at any time for misconduct, returning the convict to full custody. Now, this system was designed to encourage good behaviour and support gradual reintegration into society. Well, that was the aim anyway. Now, unfortunately for Benjamin, his behaviour appeared to deteriorate with increased freedom. He was charged with drunkenness and 2 counts of willful misconduct, for which he received 2 days in solitary confinement. This likely disqualified him from receiving a conditional pardon. Now, I noticed a couple of headstones up the back here of the cemetery, and I had a little suspicion that they may have been some Chinese graves. And I was right, except for this one. Who's this? A Thomas. No, I don't know what he was doing at the back of the cemetery, but there were some Chinese graves here. And it's so sad to see these headstones lying here broken and in disrepair. And I really encourage anyone at the Dunolly Cemetery or on the Dunolly Cemetery Trust to maybe just set up a memorial wall like they do at Castlemaine. And I love this one, David King Wing, a true Christian. I think that's great. How wonderful it would be if we could somehow preserve these Chinese headstones. Look, not just the Chinese headstones, even though that is such a unique part of the goldfields history, but all the headstones that are laying broken and in disarray in our cemeteries. If we could just set up memorial walls like they do at Ararat Cemetery and the Castlemaine Cemetery. They're just 2 cemeteries that I've seen do it really well. And I just think it would be such a great idea to preserve our history, especially our Chinese history, on the gold fields, because it is so unique. Okay, back to Benjamin and Thomas. So a conditional pardon was a significant step towards freedom, and it released a convict from most restrictions of their sentence, allowing them to live and work freely within the colony without the need for regular reporting. However, the key condition was that they were not permitted to return to Britain or travel outside the colony without official permission. These pardons were typically granted for good behaviour or valuable service and were seen as both a reward and an incentive for reform. And Thomas received his in July of 1842. And like I've said previously, I don't believe Benjamin ever received one because of his charges of drunkenness. Now finally, both brothers were granted their certificates of freedom in June of 1844, having completed their 7-year transportation sentences. A certificate of freedom meant the convict had fully served their time and was now officially free. They were no longer under any restrictions. They could live where they wished, work for whomever they chose, and even leave the colony or return to Britain, although in reality, of course, most would never be able to afford that journey. In February 1845, Benjamin was granted permission to marry an Irish convict named Mary Hawthorne. Now, Mary had been working as a servant in Manchester when she was transported for 7 years for stealing spoons, clothing and a scent box from her employer. Now, at the time of their marriage, Mary had only 3 months remaining before she was eligible for her certificate of freedom. She had been assigned as a domestic servant to the Kerr family in Hamilton. Unfortunately, Mary had a history of charges for drunken and disorderly behaviour. And sadly, this struggle with alcohol would follow her into her marriage and ultimately contribute to her death on the Victorian goldfields. Benjamin and Mary were married at St. Peter's Church in Hamilton, in Tasmania, and their marriage certificate records Benjamin as a labourer. That same year, their first child was born, a daughter named Mary Ann. A few months later, well ahead of the gold rush in Victoria, the couple and their daughter boarded the Flying Fish from Hobart to Port Phillip. Even before gold was discovered, Port Phillip was developing rapidly. It offered more opportunities for work, especially in agriculture, construction and domestic service. Freed convicts often found it easier to get employment or even acquire land there compared to the more established and convict-saturated Tasmania. It is unclear whether Thomas travelled to Victoria before or after the couple. We do know that he did move to Victoria, but there is no record of him ever marrying. Benjamin and Mary settled in Ashby, now known as Geelong West. We can trace their movements through the birth records of their children. Mary gave birth to a son, Thomas, in Ashby in 1846. That's nice, they named their eldest son after Benjamin's brother. And that was followed by a daughter, Martha, in 1848. Now, tragically, young Thomas died in 1849 at just 3 years of age. 3 years later, Mary gave birth to her final child, a son named Joshua, in Geelong. Sometime after the birth of Joshua, the family made their way further west to Buninyong. Now, Buninyong, just south of Ballarat, was a bustling township shaped by the early gold rush and its pastoral roots. Gold had been discovered there in 1851, making it one of the first sites of the Victorian gold rush, so no doubt the Bones family wanted to find their fortunes too. Now, sadly, this would be the final resting place for Mary. She died in July of 1855 in Buninyong due to intemperance habitual, meaning chronic or repeated drunkenness. Now it's in Buninyong that I first find Thomas in Victoria, and he had a dead letter waiting for him at the Buninyong post office. And that was in 1857, so I'm not sure who'd been writing to him and why he hadn't picked up the letter, but he'd moved on to Ballarat by 1858. So it is good to know that the brothers had indeed met up and were living nearby each other, maybe even sharing claims. Thomas travelled extensively through various Victorian towns and goldfields, likely in pursuit of each new gold discovery. I found him listed in various gazettes under the unclaimed letter records. Unfortunately, these were the only traces I could uncover until 1861, when he reappears under more troubling circumstances. That year, Thomas was charged in Frenchman's Gully with stealing the belongings of a man named Peter Mortison. Now, while there are several locations known as Frenchman's Gully across the goldfields, I believe Thomas was likely residing in the one near Dunolly, where Benjamin was also living at the time. And sadly, it appears that Thomas was suffering from dementia. Researcher Janet McCalman, in her book Vandemonians, The Repressed History of Colonial Victoria, was able to find an article in the Argus dated the 26th of October 1876. Now, unfortunately, I wasn't able to find the article or any more information online, but this is what it said. Under the headline, Stealing in a Dwelling, Thomas Bones, an old man, pleaded not guilty to an indictment for stealing a pistol and other property belonging to Peter Mortison. The jail surgeon, Peter Lemon, deposed that the prisoner appeared perfectly childlike and silly, and incapable of understanding the proceedings and making a proper defence. The prisoner had been like this for 3 months. The governor of the jail, Charles Forster, agreed with the surgeon's evidence, and so did the jury, and poor old Thomas was admitted into the Yarra Bend Lunatic Asylum in Melbourne, not a place you want to be, on the 28th of August 1861. The Yarra Bend Asylum was Victoria's first permanent mental health facility, established in 1848. Initially known as Tarban Creek Asylum and part of the New South Wales system, it became the Yarra Bend Lunatic Asylum when Victoria separated from New South Wales in 1851. Now, Tim Callaghan, a reporter at the ABC, wrote in a news article in 2024, he wrote, "Above ground there's almost nothing left of the Yarra Bend Lunatic Asylum, apart from a single pillar from the front gate, through which hundreds of people entered never to leave." Treatment, in inverted commas, of the mentally ill might be a rather charitable description of what happened to people who found their way to Yarra Bend, which for more than 80 years was neither good enough nor big enough to be fit for purpose. Almost from the moment it was built until it was bulldozed in the 1920s, Yarra Bend Lunatic Asylum was subject to scrutiny. Inquiries into the conditions in the facility and the treatment of patients, or inmates as they were referred to, were almost ongoing throughout the asylum's history, and it's not hard to see why. It was grim. Evidence given to boards of inquiry tell of patients being found dead, covered in bed sores, and of patients being beaten and subjected to cruel treatment, and there's also sexual violence as well. Yarra Bend Asylum is ever rising up like a terrible nightmare, read the lead paragraph to one story published in the Leader in 1862. The writer suggested nobody could object if one of the many inquiries found the whole people of Victoria guilty of manslaughter. In the 1870s, a journalist writing under the moniker of the Vagabond claimed to have spent a month working at Yarra Bend and wrote in the Argus of his experience. He recounted the treatment handed out by an attendant to a patient who'd thrown his dinner plate to the floor of his cell. He said he passed his arm around his throat and garroted him, dragged him out of bed onto the ground, half strangling him, then gave him a dozen more blows on the back of the head and neck, he wrote. Can you imagine if that was Thomas? Suffering from dementia, not knowing what was happening, and treated like an animal. Thomas survived 11 years at Yarra Bend. I shudder to think of the abuse he endured and the conditions he survived. ABC reporter Tim Callanan continues. The Yarra Bend location was well away from the township, so it was hidden away. People were out of sight, out of mind, almost. One of the more shocking findings of an early inquiry in the 1860s was that around 20% of people admitted to the asylum would die there. Over the decades, that constituted more than 1,000 deaths, with the vast majority of those people being buried in the on-site cemetery. Maps from the 1800s place the cemetery by the river in what is now the practice fairway of the Yarra Bend golf course, and that is where Thomas now rests, in an unmarked grave in an unmarked cemetery beside the Yarra River. He died on the 22nd of October 1872. There would have been no funeral, no ceremony, no formal acknowledgement of his life. I can't help but wonder, was his brother even notified? Probably not. Following the death of his wife, Mary, Benjamin and his 3 surviving children moved to a place called Rathscar, an area of farmland between Avoca and Dunolly. There he leased land, likely to try his hand at farming. His daughter Martha married an Englishman, John Herbert Payne, the son of a reverend, in 1862. His eldest daughter, Mary Ann, married a man named George Blanchard in 1870. Sadly, Benjamin's son Joshua died in 1873 at just 23 years of age. Now, there are only a few records available regarding Benjamin's movements. There is no evidence that he remarried. One record from 1873 lists him among lessees of Crown land who had not paid their rent. 2 more records appear in 1878. One is an application to transfer his lease, and the other is a fine issued at the Petty Sessions in Dunolly on June the 4th. Constable Potter had charged Benjamin with cutting live timber from Crown land without a licence, and he was fined 2 shillings and 6 pence, which he paid on the same day. Now, Benjamin lived for another 8 years, and it's likely that his daughter Martha and her husband cared for him during this time, perhaps even helping to work the land in Rathscar. And here is Benjamin's grave. I've noticed all the boneses have these lovely big stones for headstones. What a great idea. And there's Benjamin. Now, Benjamin died of old age in February 1886. And if you have any further information or are a descendant of Benjamin, please let us know in the comments below. Now, we remember Thomas and Benjamin. Their story, like so many convict stories, is one of survival, hardship and endurance. It's a reminder of how poverty, punishment and circumstance shaped the lives of thousands who built the foundations of colonial Australia. Benjamin lies in a marked grave here in Dunolly, and Thomas in an unmarked one beneath the fairway of a Melbourne golf course. And if you're ever at that golf course in Melbourne, just remember Thomas and all those who lie beneath your feet. Forgotten by history, but not by us. We remember them as part of our extraordinary convict history. I want to thank you for watching, and I really want to thank you for all your comments and support and subscriptions of the channel. I'm currently working on the next story, the next video, which is about 2 sisters who were both transported. So if you're interested in that, please subscribe and hopefully it will be out soon. Thank you.